I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. An Ice Age species, Holocene tech, and an Anthropocene future. Our species, Homo sapiens, came into existence during the period known as the Pleistocene. That is, the Ice Ages. Now, the Pleistocene lasted for about 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. And in that time, many other species of humans evolved too. Since I finished my degree in archaeology back in 95, that's 1995, not 1895, the situation has become far more convoluted. There used to be this nice, neat chronology. The Australopithecines, sort of upright, hairy chimp types, of which there were many varieties, but out of that lineage came Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens. And of course the Neanderthals were slotted in there somewhere, but it didn't matter because we had nothing to do with them. We now know that the Neanderthals and our species interbred to an extent, as did the Denisovans and our ancestors, which is another species we've discovered lately. Then there's the very different Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species from Indonesia. And I suspect attempts were made to mate with these too, just that none of their genes have made it through to us in the modern age. The point I'm getting to, eventually, is that all this happened, well, from Homo habilis onwards in the Pleistocene. We, at some point, eventually became the only naked bipedal ape on the planet. We were and still are a product of that environment in which we evolved. The Pleistocene, as lived in Africa. There is a barely supported these days suggestion that Homo sapiens evolved in Asia from Homo erectus in that area, but the genetic studies have virtually ruled that out, so we'll keep going with the out of Africa theory. So what I hear you say? Well, the environment determines the patterns of living for species. Not many, perhaps one mammal, the mountain pygmy possum, hibernates in Australia. In places where snow is thicker on the ground through winter, and the places where glaciers are more numerous, many more species hibernate. So that's sort of a simple explanation of what I'm talking about. Now, this period, the Holocene, laid down many of our distinctive traits as a species. The three foodstuffs in short supply during this period were sugar, salt and fat. So for sugar, think honey and fruits, and you can see how hard it was to get honey with all the bees protecting it, and fruits were seasonal. Salt was a problem in direct opposition to its current position. No salt meant low blood pressure, and so there was a constant search for salt in the diet. Fat was available in animals, obviously, but wild animals did not have the fat deposits of domesticates. And there weren't many domesticates, or any domesticates, for 99% of the Pleistocene. Nuts and, odd to modern human ears, things like moths were a great source of fat. There were huge gatherings of First Nations peoples in the southeast of Australia, in the snowy mountains, to take advantage of an annual bogong moth migration. And I suspect the salmon runs of the Northern Hemisphere serve similar purposes. Apart from food supply, the Pleistocene varied wildly in climatic conditions. Waves of glaciers forming and melting and reforming for the entire period. The climate was not conducive to any form of food production other than the fisher gathering and hunting. And the idea of gardening, let alone agriculture, was just not on the minds of these people. And the fact that we actually got round to doing that sort of stuff is a huge step that I don't think we can really grasp, having always grown up with agriculture and gardens. So the climate, the food, and the relatively large numbers of predators compared to nowadays shaped our species, and it would appear hardwired our thinking in the Pleistocene. Long-term planning was pointless, the seasons were highly changeable. We needed shortcuts in our thinking processes to avoid predators. So you see a sign, you react immediately. The fight or flight response being built into our adrenal systems. Now, those individuals without a sufficiently developed fight or flight response were unlikely to live long enough to reproduce. Tigers and such like doing what they're doing. Now, underpinning all this was our ability to walk for long distances and to run. We developed a particular energy economy, for want of a better expression, and we also developed culture, so that in dearth years we could call upon about 6 loosely connected groups to help us, unless the dearth was more general and then people died quite often. Quickness of reactions, a sharing economy, and a body driven to consume the 3 things in short supply, sugar, salt and fat, had us as the human species best able to handle the conditions of the Pleistocene, especially as it came to an end. What followed was the Holocene, generally warmer, more stable and more predictable. That's not to say change never happened, it did, with some returns to cooler, drier conditions. But on the whole, things were as they had been within living memory. Remember, this epoch began about 12,000 years ago. In that time, we as a species developed agriculture, and this has underpinned much of the changes in human society since then. I would argue all of the changes in human society since then. Some cultures, First Nations here in Australia and in North America, developed different responses to this lack of change. Unfortunately, much of that knowledge is now lost, but sufficient may have survived, and I'll come to that later. As I discussed in episode 260, Small-Scale Grain Growing, the technology of the domesticators influenced the way things were domesticated. But once domestication began, there are very few examples of cultures choosing to revert to a fishing, gathering, hunting way of living. There's a few, but not many. There's a mob of Māori that left the 2 main islands of New Zealand and went off to a smaller island, whose name I cannot remember at the moment. But they had agriculture and gardening and whatnot while they were in New Zealand, but chose to revert to hunter-gathering once they were on this small island and were unable to get back. So a few, but not many. Agriculture is the key technological cultural change we developed during the Holocene. Everything else from socks to iPads to motorcycles is predicated upon this technology. And it's a technology that alters landscapes. And it is this technology that created the Anthropocene. There's a line in the stones across the world that makes that point. There's a few, actually, but the one I'm most I think most defines where we are now is the radioactive one from all the above-ground nuclear tests we carried out as a species. I suspect over time they'll be able to find layers of plastic as well, but I'm more inclined to go with the nuclear one. Now, this marker is underpinned by the fossil fuels which now wreck our planetary system. No fossil fuels, it's unlikely, would have gotten to nuclear power. The CO2 and the methane are bad enough, but these support a global food system supplying the sugar, salt and fat our Pleistocene bodies crave. We have successfully solved the shortage of that epoch, and in so doing our hubris has ended the Holocene and introduced our epoch, the Anthropocene, the epoch of a human-altered planet and human-altered planetary systems. From the carbon and nitrogen cycles to the weather patterns, the lost topsoil, the plastics-filled oceans and ocean life, the livestock in cages, to the lunacy of billionaires racing to be the first in space, whilst people starve in engineered famines. We have done a great job overcoming the food shortages of the Pleistocene. Yet we have amongst us those whose thinking can save us, and this huge but fragile lump of rock spinning through time-space. The First Nations of this world, as they have survived the onslaught of societies driven by the Holocene's greatest technological jump, agriculture, may just be our one last chance. A mindset that sees everything as an interconnected whole is more likely, I think, to find our way out of this mess than a machine for pumping excess CO2 into the underground reservoirs. A technology and a mindset of kindness towards all living and inanimate things offers us great hope. We are all part of this system we call the biosphere. We have but a half generation to pull our heads out of the sand, a half generation that we are already part way through. If we are to survive the wildfires, the storms, the droughts and the plagues of mice, locusts and viruses, and herd stupidity, We must realign our actions with the cycles of the planet. First Nations have known this, still know it, and a few voices in the wilderness, coming out of the agricultural societies, getting louder now. The Fukuokas and the Mollisons have, and more urgently now, point us to the one very great truth. We are nature, and nature is us. What less can I do from Fukuoka? And though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. Mollison. We don't have long, people, but we need to get going now. So if you'd like to start your gardening adventure, to do your little bit to sequester a little bit more carbon and remove transport from your food costs and any number of other advantages that come from growing your own food, there's a free ebook to get you started over at the website, worldorganicnews.com/free ebook/. And that's where you can get a copy of it. We don't have long though, so we need to decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening. This has been a JM Podcasting Services production. Link in the show notes.